In the heart of a snowstorm, a trembling little girl clutching her baby sister knocked on a lonely millionaire's door. "Please, just one night. We have nowhere else." What he said next changed everything and began a story neither could have imagined. The wind howled like a wounded animal outside the glass and stone mansion nestled high in the frozen hills of Aspen Ridge. Snow battered the tall windows in sheets, thick and relentless. Inside, Graham Walker sat motionless before a crackling fire, a tumbler of bourbon resting in his hand. The firelight danced across the sleek surfaces of the room. Minimalist furniture, silent tech panels, walls of gray and glass, but none of it touched his face. He stared blankly into the flames, as if daring them to burn through the thick fog inside his mind. The bourbon wasn't for pleasure. It was ritual. Noise to drown out the silence. A sedative for a man too tired to care but too aware to sleep. The glass felt oversized in his palm, its chill pressing into his fingers like a reminder. This house, this life, this everything was too big, too empty, too echoing. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Maybe that's why the knock didn't register at first. A faint thump against the heavy oak door, almost drowned out by the storm. He blinked slowly, dismissing it as wind or a branch. But then, another knock. Firmer, urgent. Graham set down the glass, his brow furrowing. He stood, bones aching from stillness, and walked toward the foyer. Each step echoed against the cold stone floor. The storm roared louder as he neared the door. When he pulled it open, the cold slapped him in the face. But it wasn't the wind that made his breath catch. A little girl stood there, no taller than his chest, bundled in a threadbare jacket that was soaked through. Snow clung to her hair and lashes, and her cheeks were raw with cold. In her arms, wrapped in a hospital blanket, was a newborn baby, still and silent, her tiny breath forming faint clouds in the air. The girl looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper through trembling lips. "Please, just one night. We have nowhere else." For a moment, Graham couldn't move. The heat from the fireplace behind him met the frozen gusts blowing through the doorway. But it was her eyes that froze him in place. Wide, desperate, too old for her age. Something inside his chest twisted violently. He wanted to shut the door. God, he needed to. This, whatever this was chaos, risk, vulnerability. Everything he had built his life to avoid. He'd spent years crafting this fortress of stillness, of distance. But this girl, this baby, they pierced it in an instant. His jaw clenched, his pulse thudded behind his ears. He felt the old instinct rise, to retreat, to protect himself. But there was something deeper beneath that reflex, something buried. A flicker of memory, of being small and freezing and waiting for a door that never opened. His hand gripped the edge of the door. His whole body tensed. But then, his gaze dropped to the baby. The child's lips were slightly parted, and her hand clutched a piece of her sister's scarf. The girl swayed slightly under the weight, but didn't let go. Graham's face twisted, not in pity, but in something raw. Between cold calculation and fear, something unfamiliar stirred, and without saying a word, he stepped aside. The girl hesitated. "Just one night," she repeated, her voice hoarse. He nodded once. "Get inside." She stepped in carefully, keeping the baby close. Snow melted instantly on the polished floor beneath her boots. Graham closed the door behind them, shutting out the storm, and unknowingly, the man he used to be. The warmth hit her like a wave. She didn't ask where to go, didn't thank him. She just knelt by the edge of the entryway, unwrapping the baby's blanket slightly, checking her skin, whispering to calm her. Graham stood behind her, watching silently. Something inside him shifted, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel safe. It felt broken. And maybe that was the beginning. Graham stood motionless in the hallway, the door now sealed behind them, cutting off the roar of the storm. But the silence that replaced it wasn't the familiar kind, the kind he had cultivated for years like a sacred ritual. This silence was heavy, intrusive, filled with breath and presence that didn't belong. Or rather, that hadn't belonged. Until now. The girl didn't ask where to go. She didn't speak at all. She simply moved toward the corner of the living room, kneeling by the cold slate floor, gently rocking the infant in her arms. Her movements were practiced, quiet, controlled, as if she'd done this before, many times. Graham watched from the edge of the foyer, his arms crossed, mind racing. His first instinct was to call someone, anyone, a shelter, the sheriff's office. But something about her, the way she shielded the baby's face with her palm, the way her own shoulders curled inward like she was used to bracing for more than just the cold. It all scraped against something in him he'd rather leave untouched. Wordlessly, he moved into the living room and kicked aside the corner of a throw blanket that had been folded on the couch. With mechanical detachment, he pulled a small basket from under the coffee table and cleared out magazines, coasters, and an unopened package of tech gadgets he never bothered to install. He laid down the blanket, placed 2 firm couch cushions on the floor, and motioned toward them. She nodded silently, shifting the baby, Maisie, she had said in a whisper, and laying her down as if she were made of spun glass. The baby whimpered once, a soft, fragile sound, and the girl, Ellie, placed 2 fingers on her chest and began to hum something under her breath. Not a lullaby exactly, but a melody. It was the kind of sound you'd expect from a mother, not a 10-year-old girl in soggy shoes. Graham turned away. He walked to the fireplace, poked the embers back to life, then sat heavily in the oversized leather chair. He reached for his bourbon again, then thought better of it, and set the glass down untouched. He didn't want to drink with them in the house. The thought startled him. It wasn't long before the baby stirred again. Ellie moved fast, lifting her before a real cry could build, holding her against her chest and patting her back in slow, rhythmic circles. Graham glanced sideways. She didn't even look up. Her eyes were focused on the baby, half-lidded with exhaustion, but steady. Her free hand tucked a corner of the blanket under Maisie's chin. Every motion was precise, gentle, too practiced. That's what got him. He had seen nannies do this kind of thing in airports or on business trips. Calm, professional, trained. But Ellie wasn't trained. She was surviving, and somehow it felt familiar. He cleared his throat. "You hungry?" Ellie paused, then nodded once without meeting his eyes. Graham rose and walked into the kitchen. The lights flickered on as he entered, a soft hum of automation responding to movement. He opened the fridge and frowned. He hadn't shopped in over a week. There was wine, mustard, takeout containers he didn't trust, and 3 cartons of almond milk. He rummaged through a cabinet and found some dry oatmeal packets, then retrieved a small pan and a bottle of water. Back in the living room, he set a steaming bowl of oatmeal down on the table near the hearth, along with a glass of water and a spoon. Ellie looked up, wary, but after a pause, she shifted Maisie into her lap and picked up the spoon with her free hand. She ate slowly, methodically, not desperate like someone starving, but with the quiet discipline of someone who had learned never to waste what little she was given. "Bathroom's down the hall," Graham said quietly. "First door on the left." Ellie nodded again, still not speaking. Graham sat down opposite her, arms resting on his knees. The fire crackled between them. He watched her for a long moment, then asked, "How old's the baby?" "6 months," Ellie answered, voice hoarse. "Your sister?" She nodded. He wanted to ask more, but her expression was distant, fragile. She had walls, just like him, but hers were built from survival, not choice. As the fire dimmed and the house settled into nighttime quiet, Graham stood up and headed to his bedroom. He paused in the doorway, then turned back and retrieved a folded comforter from the linen closet. When he returned to the living room, Ellie had curled up beside the baby on the makeshift floor bed, one arm cradling Maisie, the other holding the spoon like a weapon she'd forgotten to put down. He laid the comforter gently over both of them. Ellie stirred but didn't open her eyes. Upstairs, Graham stood by the window, watching the snow thicken outside. But his mind wasn't on the storm. It was downstairs, in the softness of a baby's breath, the way Ellie hummed with no one to hum for her, the careful quiet of her movements. She reminded him of something buried so deep he'd nearly forgotten it, of himself. That night, Graham didn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds below, the shuffle of blankets, a cough, the creak of floorboards. At some point, he heard Ellie's voice, soft as thread, humming that same tune again. The baby let out a small, content sigh. And for the first time in years, Graham Walker felt something he didn't quite recognize. He wasn't alone. And somehow, that terrified him more than the silence ever did. The morning light filtered through the tall windows like a veil, soft, silver, and reluctant. Graham moved quietly through the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee cutting through the chill still lingering in the air. He placed a single plate on the counter. Scrambled eggs, toast, and a sliced apple. It wasn't gourmet, but it was warm. He hadn't cooked for anyone in years. Ellie sat at the edge of the dining table, shoulders hunched, her sleeves pulled over her hands. Maisie lay bundled in the baby carrier beside her, cheeks flushed with sleep. The girl hadn't said a word since waking, just moved like a ghost through the hallway, keeping close to her sister, avoiding eye contact like it might cost her something. "Eat while it's warm," Graham said simply, sitting across from her. She glanced at the plate, then picked up the fork without a word. Her movements were neat, careful. She didn't devour the food like someone starved, but she didn't waste a crumb either. Every bite was methodical, as if rationed from years of caution. He studied her in silence, something heavy pressing behind his ribs. Minutes passed. Graham sipped his coffee, letting the warmth spread through his chest, while the storm outside melted into a dull gray hush. He thought the conversation was over, but then Ellie's voice cut through the stillness like a thread unraveling. "My dad's name was Kevin," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the table. "He was healthy. Played catch with me 3 days before it happened. Then one morning, I woke up, and he didn't." Graham set his mug down slowly, watching her face. "He had a heart attack. That's what they said." At the hospital, Monica Monroe didn't cry. She just stared at her phone. While I held Maisie, Ellie's hand reached for a crumb on the plate, but her fingers stopped midair. After the funeral, she said she couldn't raise someone else's kids. Said we reminded her of a mistake. Graham didn't move, but every muscle in his back was tight. "She packed my stuff in trash bags," Ellie continued. Threw one of them down the stairs. Told me to take Maisie and get out. Said if I left the baby, she'd consider calling CPS. Her voice didn't break. It didn't rise. It came out flat. Like she'd rehearsed this in her mind too many times to cry anymore. Graham's jaw twitched. I tried the neighbors, Ellie said after a pause. Mr. Dalton, next door. He looked right at me through the window and closed the blinds. That did it. Graham felt something rupture quietly beneath the surface. Not an explosion, just a deep, guttural shift. A kind of disgust that curled in his stomach and anchored itself to his spine. Not at her. Not even at Monica entirely, but at a world that let this happen. At adults who shut the blinds on children begging for help. He stood suddenly, pushing back from the table. Ellie flinched, just barely. I'm not mad at you, he said quickly, steadying his voice. She looked up, startled. He broke off, running a hand down his face. People like her, like Monica, they don't get to win. Ellie blinked. She didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. He walked toward the fireplace, stared into the ash where flames had danced hours before. His reflection flickered faintly in the glass. He didn't recognize himself. You know, he said after a long moment, I spent the first 11 years of my life bouncing between homes. Foster care, shelters, got passed around like luggage. I was quiet, like you. Didn't want to make noise, didn't want to be a burden. It never mattered. People see what they want. Ellie didn't interrupt. She just listened, her eyes sharper now, as if trying to see the boy behind the man. I got lucky eventually. Got adopted by a teacher in Kansas. She gave me a computer, told me I was smart. That's all it took. One person, he turned around, facing her directly. I don't know what this is yet, he said carefully. But I do know this isn't going to be the end of your story. Ellie's mouth opened slightly, but she didn't speak. Graham walked toward the side table, picked up his phone, and without a word, began dialing. Ellie's brows knit together. Who are you calling? She asked, her voice small but edged with fear. He paused. Someone who can help. She stood quickly, Maisie stirring in the carrier. If you call CPS, I'm not, he said firmly. I'm calling someone I trust. A friend. She's a lawyer. Her name's Madeline. Ellie hesitated, eyes wide, lips trembling like she wanted to believe him, but didn't know how. You're safe here, Ellie, Graham said, lowering his voice. And I don't break promises. She sat back down slowly, clutching the baby's carrier handle like a lifeline. Graham turned his back and raised the phone to his ear. Madeline, he said when the line clicked. I need you to come up to Aspen Ridge. It's urgent and personal. There was a long pause on the other end, then a sigh. You never call for personal, Graham. I'll be there tonight. He ended the call and turned back to Ellie, who was watching him like she'd never seen anyone quite like him before. You didn't have to let us in, she said quietly. I know, he replied. But I'm glad I did. And in the thick stillness that followed, something shifted, just slightly, in the way Ellie breathed. Graham saw it. She wasn't running anymore. She was beginning to hope. The snow hadn't let up. By nightfall, Aspen Ridge was buried under a thick, icy quilt that silenced the town and wrapped every house in white. But inside Graham's home, the quiet wasn't peaceful. Maisie burned with fever. She had been fussing for hours, her small body restless in Ellie's arms, cheeks flushed and clammy. The baby's soft whimpers had turned to short, dry cries, thin and weak. Ellie had tried everything: cool cloths, rocking, humming the lullaby their father used to sing. Nothing worked. Graham stood at the kitchen counter, staring at the thermometer. 102.7. Ellie paced in tight circles near the fireplace, her eyes wild with panic. She's getting worse. I don't know what else to do. She won't drink anything now. Graham didn't hesitate. Get your shoes, he said, already pulling his coat from the rack. Ellie blinked. What? But the roads. I'll get us down, he said sharply. I'm not risking her lungs overnight. He moved fast, grabbing a thick wool blanket, wrapping Maisie inside, tucking a hot water bottle near her feet. He barely noticed the snow piling on his shoulders as he opened the garage door and reversed the SUV out into the blizzard. The tires groaned against the packed ice, visibility nearly zero. In the back seat, Ellie sat with Maisie cradled tight to her chest, whispering over and over, "It's gonna be okay, baby. Please be okay." Graham's hands were tight on the wheel. The windshield wipers struggled against the onslaught of snow, but he didn't slow down. Every second counted. He didn't care about the cold or the fact that this road was rarely plowed at night. All that mattered was getting her there. The nearest emergency clinic was 20 miles down the mountain. By the time they reached the hospital, Graham's knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel. He pulled into the emergency bay and jumped out, flinging the back door open and scooping Maisie into his arms without thinking. "Let's go," he barked. Inside, the lobby was harsh with fluorescent lights and the sterile scent of antiseptic. A nurse approached, calm but alert, and led them straight through intake when she saw the baby's condition. But as they passed through the hallway, Ellie froze. Just beyond the check-in desk stood two figures in dark jackets, one holding a clipboard, the other scanning the room with sharp eyes. Child Protective Services. Ellie stopped cold. Her breath hitched. No, Graham, they'll take her. They'll split us up." Her voice cracked into a whimper. "They don't let kids stay together. Please, don't let them take her." Graham turned. She was backing up, her back pressed against the wall, eyes darting between the agents and the door. He moved fast, stepped in front of her, shielding her from their line of sight. "They're with me," he said firmly to the nurse, loud enough for the agents to hear. "Both of them. I take full responsibility. You understand?" The nurse paused, uncertain, but nodded and ushered them toward an exam room. Graham didn't wait to hear if CPS followed. He gripped Ellie's hand, gently but tightly, and didn't let go. "Stay with me," he whispered. "I've got you." "No one's taking her?" Ellie's lower lip trembled, but she nodded, swallowing a sob. In the room, the doctor examined Maisie quickly. The verdict came fast. Early-stage lung infection. Treatable. Scary, but manageable with proper care. "She's a strong little girl," the doctor said, scribbling on a chart. "She's lucky someone brought her in when they did." Graham exhaled, breath shaky. Not relief, more like something pent up finally breaking loose. As the nurses settled Maisie into a bassinet under a heat lamp, Ellie sat beside her, holding her tiny hand through the rails. "She hasn't been this quiet since the day she was born," Ellie whispered, voice breaking. Graham sat down beside her, elbows on his knees. "You did good," he said. "She's safe." "Because of you," Ellie shook her head. "No, you brought us here." "We both did," he said. "Together." A few minutes passed before a knock came on the door. It was one of the CPS agents, a tall woman with a kind face and tired eyes. "Mr. Walker?" Graham stood, stepping into the hall. The agent lowered her voice. We got a tip earlier tonight about a child matching Maisie's description. A neighbor saw her with an older sibling. No legal guardian, no paperwork. Graham didn't blink. They're with me, temporarily under my care. I've already contacted my attorney. The agent studied him. You understand there's a process. I do, he said, and I'm ready to go through it. But I won't let anyone separate them. I'll file emergency guardianship papers in the morning. She sighed, nodding. Then we'll wait to proceed until we hear from your attorney. Graham returned to the room and closed the door quietly behind him. Ellie sat curled beside the crib, her hand still resting on Maisie's. The tension hadn't left her body. Are they gone? She asked, barely audible. For now, he said, then knelt down so they were eye to eye. Do you trust me? I don't know, she whispered honestly, but I want to. He nodded, understanding. Then, without flinching, he reached forward and gently placed a hand over hers. I promised you something. I meant it. Her eyes welled, but she didn't look away. Do you promise not to let them take us? She asked, voice shaking. Graham's throat tightened. I give you my word. In that sterile hospital room, under the hum of machines and the soft beep of monitors, something unspoken passed between them. Not a contract, not an obligation, a beginning. When Maisie stirred slightly and let out a small, croaky sigh, Graham looked at her like she was something sacred. And Ellie, for the first time since the snowstorm began, leaned her head against his shoulder. Not because she had to, but because, for the first time in a very long time, she believed she might be safe. By the time they returned to the house, the storm had quieted to a hush, leaving behind a world wrapped in white. Trees sagged under the weight of fresh snow, icicles hung like glass daggers from the eaves, and the mountain was so still it almost looked like it had stopped breathing. Inside, the house felt warmer, not just from the heat, but from something else that had started to shift. Graham placed Maisie's carrier gently on the floor, watching her chest rise and fall in sleep. Her cheeks were less red now, her tiny fingers twitching in dreams. Ellie hovered nearby, still watchful but quieter, less coiled. She looked different in the soft glow of the living room lamps, less like a kid fighting the world, and more like a kid who'd just come in from the cold. Graham stepped out of the entryway, pausing to kick off his boots. You want some tea? He asked. Ellie blinked at him, surprised by the offer. Okay. He made 2 mugs, one for her with honey, one black for himself, and handed it to her without fanfare. She held it with both hands, like it might vanish if she didn't hold on tight enough. The following evening, a pediatric humidifier Graham had rush-ordered from Denver arrived, and Maisie slept in the upstairs guest room under its gentle hum, while Ellie curled up on the end of the long leather couch. She sat cross-legged with a coloring book Graham hadn't realized he had, probably from some long-forgotten holiday visit by a business partner's kid. Crayons scattered across the coffee table, mixing in with financial magazines and old tech startup reports. She didn't say much, but she didn't have to. The house had changed, not all at once, but enough. Graham found himself setting his laptop aside more often. He left his phone charging in the kitchen instead of carrying it like a lifeline. Instead of the usual silence, the house echoed with soft things. Baby hiccups, Ellie humming nonsense while she colored, the tiny rustle of Maisie's hands against her sleep sack upstairs. The space he once guarded like a fortress was now littered with signs of life. A pacifier sat next to his whiskey decanter, Crayon marks dotted the corner of the marble countertop. A burp cloth was draped over the arm of his favorite chair. He stepped on a plastic rattle one morning and didn't curse. Just picked it up and set it carefully in the woven basket by the fireplace. Ellie didn't ask for much, but she noticed everything. One morning, Graham caught her staring at the family photo that hung above the fireplace. His adoptive parents, long gone, frozen in a happier time. "Who are they?" she asked. "My parents," he said simply. "They adopted me when I was a little older than you." She considered that for a long time, then nodded. "They look kind," she said. "They were," he replied. That afternoon, Graham returned from a quick grocery run to find something unexpected on the kitchen counter. A crayon drawing. It was crude, colorful, and unmistakably heartfelt. 3 stick figures held hands in front of a snow-covered house. One was tall, in a gray coat, one small with pigtails. The last, a tiny blob with a pink smile, above it, written in big red letters, "Home." He didn't say anything at first, just stared at it, fingers tightening around the paper bag in his hands. Something cracked open inside him, a pressure he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He folded the drawing gently and placed it on the mantel. Later that evening, Ellie made a joke, dry and quiet, but it caught him off guard. He laughed, actually laughed. It startled them both. "You okay?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "I think I forgot what that felt like," he said, rubbing his face. "What?" Laughing. "Like I meant it." She shrugged, but he caught the faint curve of a smile tugging at her mouth. That night, as the house settled around them, Graham stood in the hallway and listened. Upstairs, Maisie snored softly. Downstairs, Ellie hummed as she packed away her crayons. He closed his eyes and let the sound soak in. For the first time in years, he didn't dread waking up. He didn't feel like a man waiting for something to change. He felt present, and that terrified him in the best way. At bedtime, he passed by Ellie's door to find it slightly open. She sat on the floor, brushing Maisie's tiny curls with a toothbrush. It was too big for the job, but she handled it with care. "She likes it when I do this," Ellie said, not looking up. "It helps her sleep." Graham leaned against the doorframe. "You're good with her." Ellie nodded. "I've had to be." There was no bitterness in her tone, just fact. "Why don't you sleep upstairs?" he asked. "It's warmer." Ellie hesitated. "It feels safer being close to the door." He didn't press, just nodded, but later when she came upstairs to check on Maisie, she found the guest room rearranged. The crib was closer to the bed. A nightlight shaped like a fox glowed softly in the corner. On the bedside table sat 2 books, The Little Prince and a well-worn copy of Goodnight Moon. Ellie blinked, her throat tight. She carried Maisie in and laid her down, tucking the blanket gently around her. Then she looked around one more time before whispering, almost to herself, "It looks like someone lives here now." Downstairs, Graham stared at the crayon drawing again. His reflection wavered in the glass above the fireplace, but something about it looked steadier. Not fixed, not healed, but no longer hollow. He whispered, "I'm not alone anymore, am I?" And though no one answered, he felt the truth settle into his chest, like warmth after a long winter. By morning, Madeline had filed an ex parte emergency guardianship. The court set a preliminary hearing within days. At the preliminary hearing on emergency guardianship, the courtroom was nothing like Ellie expected. It was too bright, too quiet, eerily clean, with long wooden benches and high ceilings that made even whispers echo like thunder. The judge sat at the far end beneath a gold state seal, a stone-faced woman in a black robe whose eyes missed nothing. Beside her, a court clerk typed silently, fingers flying over the keys. Ellie sat beside Graham at the petitioner's table, her small hands folded in her lap, her shoes swinging just above the floor. Maisie lay sleeping in her carrier nearby, a tiny fist curled under her chin. Graham sat tall, shoulders squared in a tailored charcoal gray suit, but his jaw was tight. Next to him, their attorney, Madeline Sharp, flipped through a folder, lips pressed in a firm line. Across the aisle, Monica made her entrance. She swept in with dramatic flair, dressed head to toe in expensive black, pearl earrings gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Her eyes, cold and calculating, didn't look at Ellie once. She sat with a smug air beside a sharp-jawed attorney in a navy pinstripe suit, who barely glanced at his client before setting down a thick binder of documents labeled in red. Defense exhibits. The judge called for opening remarks. Monica's lawyer stood first, his tone dripping with fake civility. Your Honor, my client, Miss Monroe, is a grieving widow attempting to reunite with her late husband's children after a period of instability. We intend to prove that Mr. Walker, he nodded dismissively toward Graham, unlawfully removed the minors from her home in a clear act of personal retaliation. Ellie's spine stiffened. Graham didn't flinch. Madeline stood. Your Honor, what Mr. Walker did was not retaliation. It was protection. Protection of two children who were discarded into a snowstorm without so much as a coat. And we have the proof to show it. What followed was a war of words dressed in politeness. Monica wept on the stand, forced tears that didn't quite reach her voice. As she told the court, she had never meant to abandon the girls. I was giving Ellie space to grieve, she claimed. She misunderstood. She left on her own. She pulled out bank statements that appeared to show deposits made for Ellie's care, fabricated amounts sent from an online banking app. Graham's jaw clenched so tightly that Madeline had to place a calming hand on his arm. Madeline stood taller, her voice sharper now. We have witnesses. She called a neighbor to the stand, an older man with a limp and hearing aids, but a clear memory. His voice cracked as he repeated what he heard from the open window that night. She screamed at that girl, said, "You're not even mine. I never wanted you," then slammed the door. The courtroom was silent. Then Madeline produced the final piece, a video clip from a neighbor's doorbell camera. The footage showed Ellie in snow-covered boots, carrying Maisie bundled in blankets, struggling to step off the icy porch as Monica stood in the doorway yelling, "Get out and don't come back!" Monica's face drained of color. The judge leaned forward. Miss Monroe, do you deny this is you in the footage? Monica stammered. I don't recall, Madeline cut in. You don't recall throwing out a 10-year-old and a newborn in sub-zero temperatures? Monica's lawyer stood to object, but the judge raised a hand. That's enough. Ms. Monroe, you've lied under oath, falsified records, and, based on this footage and eyewitness accounts, committed acts of child endangerment and abandonment. Gasps echoed in the courtroom. Monica rose to her feet, eyes wide. You can't do this to me. They were never mine to begin with. The judge didn't blink. You're hereby remanded to county custody pending formal charges. Bailiff? A bailiff moved forward. Monica tried to step back, but the officer firmly cuffed her wrists behind her. This isn't fair, she screamed. He turned them against me. They were ungrateful, leeches. No one moved. No one came to her defense. As she was escorted from the courtroom, Ellie's breath caught in her throat. Her entire body trembled, not in fear, but in something like release. Like a weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there had finally fallen away. The judge looked toward the petitioner's table. "Miss Ellie," she said softly, "do you wish to live with Mr. Walker?" Ellie looked at Graham. He didn't prompt her, didn't nudge her. He just met her gaze, calm, steady, honest, and she answered with a voice clear as glass. "He's the first person who ever asked if I was okay, and actually meant it." The judge nodded. "Then I'll grant Mr. Walker temporary guardianship pending full adoption review. Maisie will remain with her sister." A breath Graham didn't know he'd been holding finally escaped. Madeline squeezed his shoulder, her eyes damp but proud. Ellie climbed down from the witness stand, legs shaky. Graham met her halfway, kneeling so they were eye to eye. "Is it really over?" she asked. "Not yet," he said. "But it's finally beginning." Maisie stirred in her carrier. Ellie bent down and gently brushed her sister's forehead. Then she turned and did something she hadn't done before. She hugged Graham. Not because she needed something, but because for the first time in her life, she felt safe enough to give something. 6 months later, Maisie's first birthday. The snow had begun to melt in Aspen Ridge, slowly retreating under the first shy breaths of spring. Icicles dripped rhythmically from the roof, and patches of green peeked through where the sun reached the earth. Inside the house on the hill, something else was thawing too, something deeper, more personal. Graham stood in the kitchen wearing an apron that didn't match his suit, because for once, he wasn't in one. Flour dusted his hands, and a dented metal mixing bowl sat beside him, half filled with lopsided batter. He glanced at the recipe Ellie had printed out from the computer and smiled grimly. "How hard could a birthday cake be?" he muttered. Upstairs, Ellie dressed Maisie in a pale yellow onesie with tiny bees across the collar. "You're one today," she whispered, smoothing the girl's soft curls. "He made you a cake." "I saw it. It leans a little. But I think that makes it special." Maisie gurgled in response, kicking her legs with delight. The dining room had been transformed. Balloons, streamers, and a homemade banner that said, "Happy First Birthday, Maisie," in bold, uneven handwriting hung above the windows. Graham had let Ellie pick everything. She'd chosen yellow and lavender. The table was modest. A few paper plates, the crooked cake with uneven pink icing, and 3 candles, one for each of them. Graham lit them slowly, his fingers shaking a little as he struck the match. Ellie held Maisie close while Graham stepped back, camera in hand. "Smile," he said. And they did. All 3 of them. Not forced, not posed, just a quiet, radiant moment frozen in time. Later, after cake and laughter and a messy diaper change, Graham found Ellie by the window, staring out at the trees swaying gently in the breeze. She held a party napkin in one hand, her expression thoughtful. "You okay?" he asked, walking up beside her. She hesitated, then nodded. "The weather's better now." "It is." "We don't want to bother you anymore," she said, voice too steady. "So, we can leave today if you want." Graham's stomach twisted. He hadn't seen it coming. "Leave?" She turned to him, eyes unreadable. "You were on the phone last night. I heard you. You were asking about foster placement options." He froze. Shame surged in his chest. "I was scared," he admitted. "I didn't think I was enough." "You mean like, good enough?" "No," he said softly. "I mean, I didn't think I was capable. Of this. Of being this person. The kind you two deserve." She looked away. "But I know now," he added. that I don't want a life without you. Either of you. Silence stretched between them, filled only by Maisie babbling to herself from the high chair in the corner. Ellie took a step closer. So what are we to you then? Graham didn't answer right away. He bent down so they were face to face and reached for her hand. You want the truth? He asked. Ellie nodded. You're not just guests. You're not a favor. You're not a burden I've taken on. His voice cracked. You're family. You're mine. And I want to be your dad, if you'll let me. Her eyes filled, but she blinked quickly, trying not to cry. She glanced back at Maisie, who squealed happily at the sound of her name in a lullaby playing faintly from the living room speaker. You want to be our dad? Ellie asked again, quieter this time. Yes, Graham said. Not just for now. Forever, Ellie didn't speak. She simply stepped forward, threw her arms around his middle and held on. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It wasn't even loud. But it hit Graham like a tidal wave. This small, quiet girl, who had once stood freezing on his doorstep, holding her baby sister like a shield, was hugging him like she'd finally stopped running. And this time, she wasn't going anywhere. That night, Graham put both girls to bed. Maisie in her crib, Ellie under a warm lavender blanket she had picked out herself. As he turned to leave her room, Ellie called out softly. Graham? He paused. Yeah? After we left the house that night, I didn't think anyone would ever choose us. Graham walked back to her side and knelt down. I didn't choose you out of pity, Ellie, he said. I chose you because I finally saw what I'd been missing. And it was you. Ellie didn't reply. She simply smiled, and as Graham walked down the hallway, he didn't feel hollow anymore. He didn't feel afraid. He felt whole. The next morning, the sun rose over Aspen Ridge with soft light and clearer skies. It marked not just a change in weather, but a shift in everything that mattered. And outside, in the snow melting on the stone steps, were two sets of small footprints. But this time, they led into the house, not away from it. Early spring, a few weeks after the adoption decree, the ink was still drying on the papers. They sat on the long oak dining table, next to a vase of fresh daffodils Ellie had arranged that morning, and a plush teddy bear Maisie had taken to dragging around by the arm. The papers weren't flashy, no gold seals or calligraphy, just legal words on crisp white paper. But to Graham, they felt sacred. Ellie Grace Walker, Maisie Ray Walker. He traced the names with his finger, lips pressed together in something close to reverence. These weren't just names on paper. They were a declaration, a promise etched into permanence. They were his daughters now, not just in spirit, in law, in heart. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and wet earth. The last of the snow had melted from the edges of the drive. Spring had arrived in Aspen Ridge, not with a loud announcement, but with quiet persistence, the way healing often did. Graham stood by the front window, watching Ellie chase Maisie barefoot across the porch. The baby's laugh rang like tiny bells as Ellie scooped her up and spun her around. Maisie squealed, clutching her sister's hair with sticky fingers. Ellie didn't even flinch. She just laughed, twirling until they collapsed onto the porch swing in a pile of tangled limbs and joy. He opened the front door and stepped out, a cup of hot cocoa in each hand. "Delivery," he said, offering one to Ellie. She sat up, grinning. "Extra marshmallows?" "Always." She took a sip, then patted the space beside her. Graham eased into the swing, Maisie crawling over his lap and curling up against his chest like she'd always belonged there. Maybe she had. They rocked gently, the creaking wood rhythmic and familiar. "You know," Ellie said after a while, "I always wondered what forever felt like." Graham looked down at her. "And?" She tilted her head. "It's not fireworks or a big speech. It's quiet, warm, like this." He swallowed hard. "Good." A moment passed. Then Ellie reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out something folded and soft. A drawing. "I made this for you," she said, handing it over. Graham unfolded the paper slowly. Crayon lines danced across the page. 3 figures, him, Ellie, and Maisie, stood holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Behind them was a house with smoke curling from the chimney, a swing set in the yard, and mountains in the background. At the top, in bright red letters, were the words, "You opened the door." Graham blinked fast. His voice caught in his throat. "Ellie, you didn't have to," she said, staring out at the trees. "But you did. You opened it, and you didn't let it close again." He folded the picture carefully and slipped it into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt. "I'll keep it close." Maisie babbled in approval, then stuck a sticky hand into Graham's cocoa. "Hey!" he laughed, pulling the cup away as the baby giggled wildly. "Looks like she wants her own cup," Ellie said. Graham stood and walked inside, only to return with a tiny mug filled with warm milk and a swirl of whipped cream on top. He handed it to Ellie. "You can share." "Thanks, Dad," she said without thinking. He froze. She froze. Their eyes met. The word hung in the air between them, unsaid for so long, unclaimed, but now it was real. "You called me," he began. "I mean, if it's okay?" she asked, suddenly shy. He nodded slowly, kneeling in front of her. "It's more than okay." Maisie squealed, tossing whipped cream onto his shoe, and all 3 of them burst out laughing. The sound rolled across the porch, into the woods, echoing like sunlight in sound. Later that night, the house glowed golden under soft lamplight. Graham stood in the hallway watching the girls sleep. Maisie was out cold in her crib, fingers still curled around her bunny. Ellie snored softly in her bed, one arm flung over her head, hair messy and wild. He sat down in the hallway, back against the wall, knees pulled up. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was waiting for something to fall apart. He felt found. He pulled the drawing from his shirt pocket and looked at it again. This time he whispered the words aloud. "You opened the door." But as he looked down the hall, he realized something else too. They had opened one for him. They hadn't just walked into his house. They'd walked into the hollow places in his life and filled them with warmth, color, laughter, and mess. And he wouldn't trade a single second of it. As dawn crept up over the ridgeline, casting long beams of light through the windows, Graham stepped onto the porch again. He held a mug of coffee, wrapped in an old sweater Ellie had spilled juice on last week. It smelled faintly of oranges and sunshine. Ellie joined him a moment later, yawning as she leaned against the porch rail. "We're going to need a bigger house if Maisie keeps taking over every room." He smirked. "She does have a gift for chaos." Ellie smiled. "But it's a good kind." They stood in silence for a beat, and then Graham said softly, "You gave me a chance to live again." Ellie looked up at him, her eyes warm. "You gave us the same." They didn't need anything more. No ceremony, no grand finale. Just this. 3 people, 1 porch, 1 sunrise, and a home that would never be empty again. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, we invite you to stay with us. Because here at Restoring Tales, every story reminds us that love, kindness, and second chances still exist. There are more tales waiting, of resilience, of hope, and of quiet heroes among us. So, if you believe in the healing power of love and the beauty of life's small moments, be sure to subscribe to Restoring Tales and turn on notifications, because the next story might be the one your heart's been waiting for. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.